A lot of problems in this country can be traced back to private equity, including unaffordable housing, unaffordable healthcare, and mass layoffs. But we're never taught how they're doing this, so I'll try to explain it as simply as I can, since I think it's important for us to know how they're screwing us over. So how it's supposed to work is pretty simple. Find a struggling business, where the owner can't improve it any further, but you can with your great business skills, so you buy that business, fix everything, and make its products better. This makes that business more valuable, so you can sell it for more money. In theory, this should help the economy, and if society gets better products from it, then you deserve to get paid. But it rarely ever works out like that. It's really more like a pump and dump, and I'll give you a real-life example of what actually happens. There's this nursing home brand called MainerCare, and it wasn't struggling at all. It was the most trusted nursing home brand in the country, because of how well they had treated their patients for 5 decades. And private equity firms love that. They actually prefer buying businesses with wholesome reputations like MainerCare, Toys R Us, or Red Lobster. Because trust is hard to recreate, takes decades to build, and it makes it way easier to milk the company. Now the thing is, the shareholders who own MainerCare are actually okay with their company getting milked. Because if the shareholders sell MainerCare, and then MainerCare gets milked afterwards, well, the shareholders don't care. The shareholders already got their nice fat stack of cash when they sold MainerCare, so it's not their problem anymore. Well, the shareholders get approached by this private equity firm called the Carlyle Group, and Carlyle says, hey guys, guess what? It's your lucky day. I'll buy out your company MainerCare for a premium. I'm talking like $6 billion, which is 20% more than market price. Well, the shareholders love that, so of course they'll sell. But Carlyle says, alright, there's one condition. I'm only going to pay you guys $1 billion, and I'll pay you guys the other $5 billion with a loan. But I don't want to take out that loan. I want MainerCare to take out the $5 billion loan, which I'll then use to buy MainerCare. That might sound confusing, but here's the step-by-step of what happens. The shareholders say, alright sure, and they force MainerCare to take out a $5 billion loan. So their company, MainerCare, is now $5 billion in debt. Not a great thing to have for your company, right? But the shareholders don't care how bad it is for the company because they're about to sell it anyway. So the shareholders take the $5 billion they just got from the bank and give it to Carlyle. Carlyle then uses that $5 billion, plus the extra $1 billion they put in themselves, to buy the company for $6 billion. So the shareholders walk away with their $6 billion, they're happy and don't care anymore. And Carlyle now owns MainerCare after buying it for just $1 billion, so they're happy. But alright, one problem. MainerCare is now $5 billion in debt, and the interest payments on that alone were about $350 million a year. But MainerCare was only making about $250 million a year in profit, meaning MainerCare is now losing $100 million a year. So how is Carlyle supposed to milk MainerCare when it's losing them $100 million a year? Well, Carlyle needs to figure out how to make MainerCare profitable enough to make up for that $100 million. And their strategy was to just slash costs, making the service worse, but still keeping the revenue stable, thanks to the trust and goodwill that MainerCare had built over decades. So Carlyle laid off nurses, cut the cleanliness standards, and cut safety standards by so much that it spiked health code violations. One family member would say that my mom would call us every day crying when she was in there. It was dirty, like a rundown motel. Roaches and ants all over the place. The nursing home deteriorated to the point where one elderly patient who needed assistance walking to the bathroom wasn't provided that because there weren't enough nurses. So she tried to go to the bathroom by herself and hit her head on a bathroom fixture. She was supposed to get a head scan for this, but there weren't enough nurses to order it. So she passed away after bleeding from her brain. And despite all of this cost cutting, Carlyle was never able to make MainerCare profitable enough to make up for those interest payments. So what do you think Carlyle does? Does it use its supposedly genius business skills to improve the service, increase revenue, and create a booming business? Actually no. Believe it or not, Carlyle would just sell every single building that MainerCare owned to make a whopping $6 billion from the sale, which Carlyle themselves pocketed. But obviously this only makes MainerCare's situation worse, because if MainerCare doesn't even own their buildings anymore, then MainerCare now has to pay rent every month, which it never had to before. So on top of those $350 million a year of interest payments that were already suffocating the business, it now has hundreds of millions of more dollars to pay every year in rent. But why would Carlyle do this? Doesn't Carlyle want MainerCare to be profitable? Well, also no at this point, because a few years later, Carlyle just gave up and made MainerCare declare bankruptcy, making their $5 billion debt burden just disappear. You would think Carlyle would have to pay that $5 billion, right? But nope, it doesn't, because MainerCare is a separate legal entity from Carlyle. And from the very start, when Carlyle bought MainerCare, Carlyle made it clear that MainerCare Manorcare owed that $5 billion in debt, not Carlyle. So that debt isn't Carlyle's problem. So if we combine this all together, Carlyle only really paid $1 billion to buy Manorcare, looted $6 billion worth of assets from Manorcare, which were all of its buildings, and then dumped Manorcare once it had nothing left, while Carlyle took zero consequences. Well, alright, but doesn't declaring bankruptcy like this lower Carlyle's credit score at least? Nope. It would lower Manorcare's credit score, but Manorcare is gone now, so who cares? Well, alright, but still, banks generally wouldn't trust Carlyle anymore after this, right? So Carlyle can't pull off the scheme anymore. Well, Carlyle can, and banks do still trust it, because the banks actually also usually get their money back. This is because during bankruptcy, the bankers are the first in line to get their money back, and Carlyle is just too valuable of a client for the banks to give up completely. Because most of the time, it doesn't end in bankruptcy, so the banks still do make money. The people who do take the risk though, and never get their money back, are the workers whose jobs are lost, and whose severance is never paid. Plus the taxpayers even, since taxpayer dollars are used to fund unemployment benefits for those laid off workers, and the patients whose lives are never recovered.